Hi, I'm Jamie Pierce, and I'm the General Counsel of the League of Oregon Cities. In this video, we are going to review public records and what city officials need to know. We will go over the purpose of the Public Records Law, retention duration, and disclosure and exemptions. So why do we have public records laws? Well, there's a need for an informed public. As members of the government, we work for the public, and they have a right to know about what is happening. Public records laws also serve for accountability for those of us who work in government. They assist with transparency, and public records laws really help with history and retention. If you're wondering, how did we get to this decision? Public records laws and those retention policies allow us to go back and to look at previous records to find out how we got to where we are. The first area I'll cover is public records retention and what cities need to know. First, for public records retention purposes, a public record is defined as anything the city prepared, owned, used, or retained that relates to any city activity, function, or transaction necessary to satisfy the city's fiscal, legal, administrative, or historical policies. There are, however, a few things that are considered not public records. So, for example, extra copies of a record. The city is only required to retain one copy of each public record. Voice messages. The city is not required to retain a copy of a voicemail message. This means that once you listen to a voicemail message, you do not need to retain it and you can promptly delete it. And last, verbal communications that are not otherwise recorded. I always recommend that if you are going to have a sensitive conversation with somebody, to do it verbally, either over the phone or in person, because you do not need to retain a record of that communication. Public records retention durations. Each city is required to maintain all of its public records or accurate copies in accordance with the state archivist retention schedules. The city's retention schedule may be found in Oregon Administrative Rule 166-200-0200. The retention schedule applies to not only city staff, but also elected officials. It's important to know, it's a crime to destroy, mutilate, conceal, remove, make a false entry in, or falsely alter any public record. This really hones in on the idea that the state lawmakers take records retention and the laws related to it very seriously. Public records laws also require the city to have a designated records custodian. Do you know who your public records custodian is? In most cities, the records custodian is the city recorder. However, I encourage all officials to double check who that person is. Records custodians should work with their city staff and officials to develop a records management system. For example, where are files being stored? How about electronic files? These are all questions to be considered when developing a records management system. And finally, there may be situations where elected officials may store certain public records at home. It is important to know that the city's records custodian has access to those records when necessary. In summary, make sure you know who your records custodian is and have a conversation with them about both a records management system and how they may access public records that you may have when necessary. Additional guidance and questions may be addressed to the state archivist. The Archives Division is part of the Oregon Secretary of State. Their contact information is available on the screen. The next area of public records law has to deal with public records disclosure. For disclosure purposes, public records is defined differently. A public record for disclosure purposes is defined as any writing containing city business information that the city prepared, owned, used, or retained. I do want to note that even though the term writing is used in this definition, writing means more than just something written on paper. It includes essentially any item. It could be an email, a text message, a video recording, an audio recording, or any other means of recordation. Do you have any city business on personal devices? Well, it might be a public record. How do you keep items separate from public records and non-public records? Well, to answer that question, let's determine what's not a public record. Something is not a public record if it is not about city business and it is on a privately owned computer or device. Now, if something is about city business and it's on a privately owned computer, it still may be a public record. If something is not about city business but is on a publicly owned computer, it may still be a public record. The best course of advice is to keep your city business separate from your personal business. Just because something is stored on a private device does not make it exempt as being a public record. Why is this important? That is because every person has a right to inspect any public record of the city. These are also known as public records requests. Now, there are exceptions found in ORS 192 that exclude certain records from disclosure. A number of items are exempt from disclosure and are contained as conditionally exempt under ORS 192.345. These items are exempt unless public interest requires disclosure in a particular instance. There are about 40 potential exemptions. Not all apply to cities. There may be another group of records that may be exempt from disclosure unless a particularized finding of the public's interest requires their disclosure. Those are found in ORS 192.355. There are about 42 potential exemptions, and again, not all apply to cities. The city may choose to disclose a record even if it could otherwise exempt its disclosure. The city may release that record to a specific person and is not necessarily required to release the whole record to the public generally. When in doubt, work with your city attorney. How do you handle public records requests, and what are the deadlines? First, when the city receives a written request for records disclosure, determine if the city is the custodian of the records. If the city is not the custodian or record holder, it is not required to respond. Within 5 business days of receipt of the records request, the city must acknowledge and confirm receipt. That can simply be a response that says, "Thank you for your request, we've received it." Then the city may want to clarify the request or provide written estimation of the cost and/or time necessary to fulfill that request. Then the city must respond. This would include gathering any records responsive, reviewing those records for potential exemptions or exclusions. This entire process must be done within 15 business days for a response after receipt of the request. However, if the city knows that it is impossible or unlikely it can fulfill the request within 15 business days, the city may communicate with the requester and provide them with a reason of why it may take them longer. The city is still considered compliant with the law so long as they have communication about timelines and when the requester can anticipate a reasonable time for the city to respond. What is the process when a requester believes that their public records request was denied or improperly handled? The process will be dependent on whether or not an appointed city official or staff member denies or improperly handles the request, or if an elected official does the same. What does a denial or improper response look like? The city may not comply with the 5-day or 15-day deadline. The city may exempt records that the requester does not believe is exempt, or the city may just ignore the request. These are all examples in which a public records request may be considered denied. If the public records request is denied by an appointed city official or staff member, a requester may appeal with the district attorney in the county for which the city is located. The district attorney then has 7 days to respond and provide an opinion. If the requester believes an elected official, such as a city councilor, denied the request, then the appeal may be filed in one or two places. The first location is the Marion County Circuit Court. The alternative location is the circuit court wherein the elected official is located. Now you may ask, why are there different locations? Well, that's because the law has provided those different locations. But it's important for cities to know that elected officials really have no business responding to, receiving, or denying public records requests. It is much easier administratively for a city to work with its local district attorney than to have to go to circuit court to respond to a public records request appeal. I encourage all cities to have a policy in place in which all public records requests must be directed to an appointed city official or staff member. Resources. Additional questions and guidance may be found in the following resources. The #1 resource for public records in Oregon is the Oregon Attorney General's Public Records and Meetings Manual. This resource is available online for free and may be found by Googling Oregon Attorney General's Public Records Manual. Cities may also look to the Secretary of State's retention schedule to determine the length in which they may be required to retain records. Cities thinking about or wanting to assess fees for the response to public records request should review the LOC's FAQ on assessing fees for the production of public records. In addition, the LOC has a municipal handbook chapter 14 on public records. And finally, if you would like additional guidance, the LOC has a model email and social media policy on retention. As always, feel free to always reach out to the LOC for any additional questions or guidance you may have.